Welcome to the Hangout Podcast. I'm your host, David Sharetta. Come on in and hang out. In this episode, I was privileged to have a conversation with Brad Wetzler. Brad is a journalist, author, adventurer, writing coach, seeker, and someone who spent his life asking big questions about meaning, resilience, the human journey, recovery. From his days as a correspondent when he was traveling the world to his deeply personal explorations of healing and self-discovery, Brad brings a wisdom that's both hard-earned and also deeply relatable. In this episode, we dive into the stories that remind us of how courage and curiosity can really reshape our lives. I had a wonderful time in this wide-ranging conversation with Brad, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. This episode contains discussion of sensitive topics, including suicide, drug use, and other adult content. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling, please seek professional help or call your local crisis hotline. Welcome, Brad. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast for a conversation this afternoon.
It's a pleasure, David. It's good to see you.
Likewise. I'd like for us to start where I start with all these conversations, which is with your origin story, where you come from, what your journey was like to this present moment, and then we'll branch off from that.
Sure. I'm going to start my origin story in the middle, and then I'm going to back up. So I grew up in Kansas, in the suburbs of Kansas City, and I was a earnest kid that came into Christianity through Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and really got obsessed with that as a young man, and ultimately then went off to college and fell in love with writers and kind of left that past behind, and then ultimately became an adventure writer through working at Outside Magazine. And I went to graduate school at Northwestern after finishing up at University of Kansas. And the day after I started there, or the day after I graduated, I landed a job as an intern and worked my way up the masthead and became a senior editor. And then, long story short, they didn't have staff writers, and so I went out on my own to be hung a shingle and became a freelance magazine writer, writing for all various magazines. So that's a little bit of it. Feel free to probe more. So
so Kansas City, huh? So
yeah.
The smack dab in the midst of barbecue and baseball and the center of the country, roughly, right?
Yes, it's the heartland, and absolutely, I was a big Royals fan and barbecue fan, and there was a radio station that talked about the three Bs, baseball, barbecue, and blues, and they had some good blues clubs there. And I remember as a young man playing guitar and watching a lot of music there too. So it was a good place to grow up. Midwestern values and played sports, played baseball when I was young, and then basketball and tennis through high school. And it's pretty flat out there in Kansas, though.
On the face of it, you had this kind of a typical Midwestern Americana upbringing and life. But as you mentioned in your memoir, there was kind of some undercurrents there, and I bring up the term undercurrent pretty intentionally because I want to return to this theme of water. Yeah. It presents itself multiple times in your life. Yeah. But the first time it's very prominent in your memoir. Can you talk to us about when it appears and this canoe trip and kind of what that kind of is the undercurrents to this kind of typical American lifestyle? I believe your dad was an attorney and successful and kind of a homemaker mom and just this leave it to beaver type of household on one hand, but then this other undercurrent.
Yeah. Good question. So everything at home appeared to be, like you said, not just normal, but kind of extraordinary. We were sort of taught to view ourselves that way. We were smart, good at sports, belonged to a tennis club, and everything, on the surface looked like it was awesome. But there was a lot going on at home. And, my dad was drinking a lot, and I was, I was struggling with that. It just felt like I was living a lie. And the more I spoke up about it, the more I seemed to get pushed out of the family system. And well, when I was 12, just to get to the undercurrent. So there was an undercurrent going on at home. And then when I was 12, we went on a father-son canoe trip, actually through the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which is the organization that I belong to. And it was father-son. And so we went down to northern Arkansas, which I think was about a 7 or 8 hour drive from Kansas City. And we got down there, and it had been raining a lot. The river was very high. The guy that owned the campground offered to give us some money back. He said it was too high, that a few people had almost died the weekend before. And but our group decided to run the river. And, on the first day, my dad and I had some trouble. Neither of us were good canoeists, and we were going backwards and sideways, the entire time. And after lunch, we put the canoe back in and got going sideways again, and the canoe tipped over. And I remember vividly the water rushing over the side of the canoe and swamping us, and I bailed out. And I remember floating downstream, and at one point then I just felt this really fast jerk and this powerful jerk backwards. And I looked up, and I was stranded in the middle of the river, and the river was very strong, and it was pushing me into this log and trying to pull me away, but also pushing me in. And I realized that my life jacket is snagged on a submerged log in the river. And I kept getting pulled down and then kind of released again. And I looked over, and I saw my dad crawling out onto the riverbank, and he looked scared, but he also looked paralyzed. And I thought he would do something to come get me. But nothing, he didn't. And there was no options. And I thought I was going to die there. It was a very tenuous situation. And I was there for, I don't know how long. I think it had to be between 5 and 10 minutes. And then, thank God, there was another canoe coming, and I remember kind of looking up and seeing a hand reaching for me, and it missed me, but then the canoe struck me or the log, and it was just a big collision. The next thing I knew, I was floating downstream, and it ended up getting pulled out of the river and put in the bottom of another boat. And then my dad eventually came over and got me. So it was a traumatic experience. I remember that night, we had a campfire, and I remember the leader of the group, saying a prayer, thanking God that I was okay. And, it was a very real experience. But then the next day we drove home, and I remember running up to tell my mom about it. And my dad stepped in front of me and basically said that what I was saying didn't happen, that I was exaggerating, and nothing like that happened. My shirt got snagged on a twig, and I was utterly confused. And at that point, I was still young, and so I didn't say anything. I had cuts up and down the side of my body and bruises, and was really sore. I remember at school just feeling so sore up and down my entire torso. And anyway, that's the story of the other undercurrent that was going on.
I wondered when I read that in the book, and I know you've shared it a lot, you wrote about it, so this is out in the public, but I'm sure it's never easy to recount that. Why do you think your dad so downplayed it? Was it this, I'm going to have a macho son thing? Because it didn't sound like, from your description of the family dynamic, he was particularly concerned about your mom judging him harshly for not keeping an eye on you, right? It was more a commentary on you or your lack of ability or something.
Yeah, I feel like there was some of that I wasn't being brave or something. But I also learned through time that taking accountability for things was not something he did, and came up over and over again. And the story well into adulthood became, up to this day even, is that my shirt got snagged on a twig. And, he and I are speaking now after a long time of not. And I've never brought that up again. I used to bring it up all the time, just trying to understand why my reality was so different from his, especially younger. I knew my experience. I'd never doubted my experience. And at the same time, you kind of get obsessed with trying to make it match up. And 10 years after this happened, I was back in Kansas City, and I was at a Kansas City Royals baseball game, and I ran into our group leader there, and I'd been kind of mulling over for the previous 10 years, why my reality didn't match up with my dad's. And first thing out of his mouth is, God, I'm so glad you're alive. And I just sort of, and it's boom, all this kind of confirmation arrived. But again, my body knows what's true, and I never really doubted it. It was just this weird obsession and confusion about this reality didn't match up with the man who I looked up to. That was the other part. It wasn't just, it was my dad's reality, and that's supreme, right? When you're a kid. So
And
it's
in some
almost bigger than
ways,
your own. So
yeah, and in some ways it remains supreme at some level throughout our whole lives, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It takes a lot of work to start to let go of that.
So you have this, despite that, or that traumatic situation, you go on, you're successful in high school, college, you become a writer, rise to the position of editor. And full disclosure, I have family in Santa Fe, and the Outside Magazine headquarters is right next to the REI store.
Yes.
Right by the train tracks. And I used to be a huge fan of Outside Magazine. In an earlier iteration of their life when it was less about product and more about story. So I would always see this beautiful Santa Fe 2-story, beautiful building and go, oh, what a dream it must be to work there in some capacity. So you work there, and on the face of it, again, you have this perfect lifestyle for an adventure-seeking young person.
Yeah.
Talk to us about the dichotomy, the light and the dark, right? Of your existence and there, and how that led into the rest of your life.
That's funny how you ask these questions, and it really has me thinking in an interesting new way of just how I arrived at this magazine, and it was my first corporate experience, but everything was not just good, but it was extraordinary there too, right? And there was a lot of masculine macho-ness around the office. So there was this appearance that everything was great in my life. I was killing it. The first few years of my work, after I left the magazine to be a writer, I was writing for the New York Times. I was a contributing editor at George, which was JFK's magazine. I was writing for GQ and Wired and all these places and living the dream, and traveling many months of the year. I was married, and we had a couple of dogs and had a great house outside of Santa Fe. And yet it seemed like with each passing year, I was falling further and further into depressions, which had struck me when I was younger, but they became deeper. And with all the travel and the time zone changes, I was coming back and falling into depressions that were lasting months and sometimes just never seeming really to leave. And it was having a lot of what I now understand to be kind of emotional flashbacks, both to the canoeing accident, but just these intense emotional surges that were running through me that I didn't understand. And eventually, I was seeing a psychiatrist. That's a whole other story, my involvement with psychiatry, but I'd gotten misdiagnosed at a young age and was taking a lot of medications, and I was working with a psychiatrist in Santa Fe that just every time I went in, he seemed to add something else. Maybe I guess I asked for it too. I was seeking answers and seeking solutions. I wanted to keep on this pace of being, I wanted to be a great writer. I wanted to be a great adventure writer, like the people that I admired when I was an editor, and yet the wheels were falling off, and I was finding myself in remote places having these terrible abandonment flashbacks. And eventually I went into the psychiatrist's office, and he said, your options are electroconvulsive therapy, shock therapy, or an antipsychotic. And I wasn't psychotic. This was just for depressions, really. And he put me on a psychotic. It was an easy choice. I was afraid of electroshock, and probably for good reason. I'd seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest too many times. And long story short, I basically went to bed for several years, and kind of crawled out occasionally when an assignment came my way, and didn't do a very good job at it, made mistakes, and went back and hardly left again. And and that went on for years.
on the one hand, your interactions. I mean, you were an integral part, for example, of John Krakauer's work around Into Thin Air, which you might not be on the front end of the public facing part of that, but behind the scenes,
Yeah.
like I'm a huge John Krakauer fan, and that was the first book of his I read, and I was transfixed by this story, and I'd never thought that there's an editor sitting back, you know, pulling all nighters, going, "Oh my God, are we going to hear from
Yeah.
John on the mountain and all that?" So you've got that you've got your writing success, and you're married in this young, energetic lifestyle, and all the trappings of, as you say, kind of the macho lifestyle, the outdoorsy, outside magazine kind of ethos.
Yeah.
Um, and do you think that that was all? I mean, adventure can be beautiful, but it also can just be an escape, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
that. Was that really your drug of choice before you actually had drugs of choice?
I think you're onto something there. Yeah. I think that it was it was very grandiose what I was up to in a way, and we all of us who were writing for that magazine, and we were paying people, to go do these crazy things and not really considering the danger that much. And there was a lot of, there was, I mean, we had a lot of women in the office and some amazing women, but there was a lot of testosterone driving the bus. Um, and I was trying to live up to, the image in my own mind of who these people were, John Krakauer and Bob Shikochis and others who seemed to so effortlessly go out into the wilds and do these crazy things and write great articles about it. That's what I wanted, and I kind of fell into a spell, underneath that all. I'm not sure, looking back, exactly if my makeup was really built for that, especially given the traumas I'd had as a kid, and my kind of fear of nature. There's kind of a real disconnect there, and the fact, and I've read enough psychology and to know that there is this idea that Freud came up with of I always forget I forget the term right now, but essentially you find yourself as an adult or later in life re-exposing yourself to the same dangers and same situations as you try to heal it. Your unconscious is trying to heal this this disconnect and this wound you have. And for me, being in nature was terrifying. And yet here I was throwing myself into places like Greenland and, you know, the Amazon and finding myself terrified a lot of the time.
So you go through this cycle of. I found myself in reading your memoir, like wanting to like. This is audio only, so I'm doing this gesture of trying to pull someone like out of a well, right? Like you start climbing up, you get a cool assignment because you still had the writing chops, and then the medication and the malaise and everything, you turn in a subpar product, and then eventually you end up getting terminated by a lot of these, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You fall into this hole. Talk to us about the travel that you were fortunate enough to do that was really part of your healing journey,
Yeah.
whether intentionally or not when you set out to do it, right? Talk to us about that, because that's where the book to me got started to get really inspirational in a deep
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. So there's a shift that happens in the book where it's a quite intense one where a friend of mine had died by suicide, and as I was sitting with his body, I just knew I had to get off these medications. I knew that I was going to end up like him, and something blinked open inside me, and around that time, I saw this little clip, and I think it was the Wall Street Journal or something about the Jesus Trail, and it was a 40-mile trail from Nazareth to Capernaum, which is on the Sea of Galilee, and it approximates the path that a historical Jesus might have walked when he left his hometown of Nazareth to begin his 3 years of teaching, and so obviously that struck a chord in me, given my youth, and I was no longer a Christian, but man, got obsessed with this, and that's one of my qualities, and maybe it's part of a addictive personality. But I get obsessed with story ideas and stories, and just really have to take them all the way. And so I ended up writing my editor at the New York Times, who I'd written for many times, and told her about this, and that I wanted to go hike it and write about it, and she said go, immediately, um, and so I bought a plane ticket, and 48 hours later I was walking the Jesus Trail, and that just whetted my appetite, though. I at that point then I wanted to go everywhere that Jesus had walked, and I was exploring whether I could be a Christian again, but I was also trying to get back in touch with myself, and I ended up going into Palestine. I spent 10 weeks, a 10-week pilgrimage in Israel and Palestine in the West Bank. And then when I came back, I realized wasn't going to be a Christian again, but it did light something up inside me about spirituality, and that I knew that there was healing that was waiting for me if I followed a path of self-compassion, of seeking something greater than myself. And knowing that my ego had played a role in my demise, and needed to find some humility like Jesus taught, and so it lit a fire in me, and yeah, that led to other things too. I could keep going.
Please do.
Okay.
Please do.
Yeah, well, so when I got back, I had begun practicing yoga earlier, and I really went full bore into practicing yoga at that time, and really began exploring the Eastern wisdom paths, and Buddhism, and especially the philosophy around yoga, which here in the West we think of yoga as just stretching in Lululemons, but there's a whole philosophy behind it about that's involved with becoming more more in your body, more centered. It kind of mirrors the Buddhist path in a way, and there's other elements of it, including you know yoga of devotion, and there's whole kind of a Christian kind of path over in the yoga world too. So anyway, went down that rabbit hole, and just really healed a lot through that exploration, and finding myself again. And then I found myself back in India, which I'd visited for Wired magazine in 1999, and just had written an article about the city of Bangalore, which was a tech center, and this was in '99. It was just taking off over there, and so I wrote this business article. But the whole time, I just was thinking I wanted to go up and visit the city called Varanasi, and it was where they burned bodies, and people actually went there to die, because if you died in Varanasi, you were more inclined to be to achieve moksha, or freedom, and not have to come back into a human body. Well, I just had to see this place, so I went up there in '99. Well, back to my other main story. In 2018, I just became obsessed. I had to go back to India, and this time I went back to northern India, and I found myself about 5 days inside a cave where a 100-year-old yogi lived. He'd been there for 25 years, meditating and chanting and living. And a few friends and I went up. We heard about him and went up and visited him. And I spent the afternoon there. And when I entered his cave, though, for the first time, the tradition is to bow at his feet. Well, I did that, and as I had my head on the floor, I started to sit up. I felt him smack my head. Now, this is going to sound, maybe strange to us here in the West, but there's a whole tradition over there of physical transmission of spiritual energy, and I was aware of that. And so, when the second it happened, I was like, "Is that what just happened?" And I sat up, and he smacked me on the head, and I sat up and looked into his eyes. And I just began weeping. It was just something, the tenderness and the age, and maybe the grandfatherliness of it, and maybe related to my own difficulty with men and my father. But I just broke open, and I wept all afternoon. And I remember then going home that night, and and I woke up the next morning, and I was watching these birds fly out over this valley, and I realized I was sort of like feeling queasy or something. I stood up, I stumbled. Eventually, I went down to where this cabin where I was staying with my then girlfriend, and told her that I felt like someone had slipped me acid, or mushrooms or something. I felt like I was out of my mind and on a drug or something. And so I ended up going up, climbing to the top of this building, and had, for the next 12 hours, I saw snakes vibrating on the ground, and all the mountains in the sky were knitted together. It was like some kind of psychedelic experience, and it lasted 12 hours. And I interpret that even as a kind of a God experience, or it was a deep mystical experience that showed me, that underneath all of our suffering and all our pain, that there is some wholeness there, and it allowed me to hold on to that notion. And I do believe it was a gift, if not from the yogi himself, then from the universe that was channeling through him. I don't know, I know this sounds crazy, but yeah.
When I read that, at first I thought, quite honestly, I thought, oh, here we have the cliche, right? We got the cliche of
Yeah.
the Westerner hiking the mountain, and then there's an old skinny dude up there, and that was the end of it. And then you get smacked.
Yeah.
And then the fallout, right? The process, it was messy and scary and
Yeah.
terrifying, actually. Scary is an understatement. And to read that was a pretty powerful experience. Were you still, I'm trying to recall, were you still on your medication at that point? Like layers and layers of meds, or?
I had been dwindling down. I'd moved away from Santa Fe. I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and the psychiatrist here had said, let's get you off all of this and figure out who you really are. And so I don't recall. I think I was taking, I think, one antidepressant, and to this day I take an antidepressant, and I take an ADHD med, and that's all. And so I was taking that at the time, and it was just, as wild as the 12-hour mystical experience was. The crying, the weeping was just as impactful. It just opened something in me that like needed to open up. The grief of years of living, of living with depression, living with, hiding it. I mean, there's at that time my mother had died, and the grief around my mother's death, the grief of all the pain that not just I experienced, but we all experience. And I think that's one of the biggest gifts I want to talk about this book is, when I wrote the book, it came out of me in this way that, like, to write a book like this, it does take some ego or something. It takes thinking that your story is worth listening to, and that it's a little bit special or something. But by the time I finished the book, and then I began, talking about it and marketing it, the more and more I realized it was it's a universal experience. Very universal in the suburbs where I grew up, where you have these families that appear to be all on the up and up, and yet there's all this suffering going on, but also just worldwide. There's far more suffering than I've experienced around the world, but it just opened something up in me, and writing the book allowed me to see kind of the universal aspect of all of this. So
you return to the theme of slowing down.
Yeah.
In previous conversations we had, you mentioned that, and I believe it's in the book as well. And I can even tell in the way you're relating this right now that this is after India didn't have the frenetic pace to it.
Yeah.
The distraction, the built-in escape elements that your prior life had. Talk to us about that, and then how that led into the work you're doing today.
Yeah.
Where, I thought, wow, this is interesting. A guy who suffered this much, then has faced his suffering in a public way with a memoir, and now he's dedicating his energies to helping other people go through a really difficult process. Like, aren't you done with the suffering? So you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like you're dipping your toe in with everybody you work with. So talk to us about that slowing down and then how
yeah,
you segue into being a coach really and a guide.
right. Well, so writing is what I've always done, and editing, and I started to teach, and I landed a job working as a teacher of memoir when I moved to Colorado, and it just slowly developed into a coaching business. But it's more than that though, because it's over the years, I just did a lot of what I call self-compassion work. And you're right to use the word slow down. I was no longer traveling around the world. I was spending a lot of time doing, practices like meditating and practicing yoga, and I had slowed my life down. I'd found a lot more compassion for myself, and I started this business of working with people on their memoirs, and I just loved it. I have this capacity to hear people's stories and reflect back to them kind of that there's legitimacy, there's something to be said there, there's not just legitimacy, but there's gold there to offer people in telling our stories. And I was I found that I just love this work, and helping people, because I had been, eventually when I wrote my own memoir, I saw how much it healed, and there was so much that just of my suffering receded into the background, almost like into the rear view mirror when I hit send on my manuscript. It was just a release, and I'd seen people say that writing memoir was healing, but I experienced it in a way that I'm convinced of it. And so I learned to walk people through the process of telling their story, being vulnerable, but also, turning it into a gift for somebody. When we write a memoir, um, memoirists kind of get a bad rap that they're narcissistic, and that it's, that they must think they're really special to do this. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think writing a memoir is such an antidote to narcissism. It's like, if you can get vulnerable about your life, and share the suffering you've been through, but share the stuff that helped you heal. You basically give somebody else a roadmap that they can see themselves in the story, and you give this great offering to other people in the world that to show that healing's possible, transformation is possible, and it just has become this joy in my life. So
I'd imagine that when it's all distilled down, there are probably just a few essential themes that pop up in a lot of the memoir work that you do, right? There's some parallels. I just finished a training on conflict mediation, and we were doing a lot of scenarios. It was a week-long, very intensive training, and at the end of the week, like, the facilitator said, "Hey, did you guys realize that there's like three themes that all of our conflicts had in common that we talked about, and you're going to see these all over. And one of them is like people are seeking a sense of recognition and belonging,
yeah,
right? They want to be heard." And I thought about those, and then I thought about in preparing for today's conversation with you, I thought about the memoir journey. Like, when you boil it down and you get past all the trappings of the quote unquote interesting things people have done.
yeah.
I'm wondering if you come down to just a few essential themes. Are you seeing them?
You're right. And I obviously every memoir is a story of how you became, you today. But the deeper theme of that really is often coming home to oneself, and so in belonging in one's own body, and belonging in one's own life. And a good memoir never has a really tidy ending, and no one, it's not true that we ever arrive in some place of full enlightenment, but there's always something else going to come down the pike. But there is transformations possible, and becoming more comfortable with who one is one of the biggest themes. It's almost like in self-love, in a weird way, ends up becoming by the end, it's sort of like everybody's just learning to accept this path they've been on and seeing it almost as necessary to become who they are. And so you're right about that. And yeah,
It's this, yeah, I know we had spoken about the hero's journey and that
yeah,
Joseph Campbell and or like Odysseus, returning home and some things are the same and some things aren't, right?
yeah,
Some things have moved on in your time and the
exactly.
and you kind of return to yourself, but yourself is somewhat shifted and
And
uh,
you've got a boon, as Campbell would say. You've got a gift to share with how you did it, how you slayed the dragons, both in the external world and in the internal world.
how do you help your clients navigate this? Because the reality is very few of them, like in any writing venture, very few people are going to write a bestseller, right? Like that's the numbers just don't play out that way, and most people don't even get a a big commercial publishing contract, right? Like that's also not how the numbers play out if you're not a celebrity, and if you are a celebrity, it's usually someone else wrote it for you anyway. So how do you navigate that whole reality with people who are very enthusiastic about their memoirs and then they're going to have to face some sort of reality and
Yeah.
then like how does that journey look?
The good news is that self-publishing and hybrid publishing has become really a legitimate thing now. And so on the one hand, those who really want to publish, there's so many options, and there are people that sell more books, reach more people with self-publishing and what's called hybrid publishing than do with landing big contracts. So that's one aspect. But then the other aspect is this healing part of it, and I try to really keep people focused on doing the work, that there's that the payoff is multifaceted, and I try to keep a little bit of a minimal view of the publishing aspect, and that we've got it. Step one is just writing a book that you love, and that is some, hopefully has some technical aspects to it that people love to read. And so, but then the other, yeah. So it's kind of, I try to keep people focused on the journey, and sort of like letting whatever happens to it. And I kind of, not to get too woo woo, but there's sort of what's supposed to happen in this case really does happen. So
What's the hybrid? Is that's some you do some of it self-publishing and then like explain that to
yeah,
listen.
so there are some companies now that are called hybrid publishers. They're kind of in between self-publishing and big time traditional publishing. And these companies, and there's some really reputable ones, they will edit your book, come up with a cover, um, and get it into bookstores just like a publisher. The only catch is, instead of you getting paid, which is what happens in traditional publishing, you pay them. But they're actually getting the book into bookstores. They have marketing teams, and so it's like, yeah, it's not cheap, but it's a way you can get your book into the world in a real way, and it does have, and they don't take everybody, by the way. So there's, you know, for better for worse, the gatekeeping at the big publishers kind of, there's some gatekeeping in a good way, and I want everyone to have their book into the world, and you can with self-publishing. But some of these publishers are good at really finding writers they want to work with, cultivating them, and putting their stuff into the world in a good way. So
And you've lived an extraordinary period of time, I think, when it comes to commercial writing, right? Like, because I'd imagine, were you born 30 years later, you would have had a very different career,
yeah,
like as an adventure writer, right? I think you might have even mentioned this in your book, but between just the just between the what am I trying to say? Like between AI, which is its own beast,
yeah,
and then just online journalist, whatever that looks like, and research that could perhaps be some portion of it be done remotely. When you started, there was no, hey, I'm gonna do Google Earth and look at this. It was like, I got to buy a plane ticket and get my rear end there.
Yeah, I hit the sweet spot. The 90s in particular were a golden period for magazines. Then they were very thick, pre-internet. All the advertising was going into these print ads, and we all had big magazines on our coffee tables, and they were prestigious and all of that. And there was money in it and money for travel. So I hit the sweet spot in terms of my career. Now I find myself writing articles that would have gotten paid $10,000 for, back in the 90s. I'm doing it for free, because it's part of my, part of what I love, and also part of my business plan, and also, just part of keep putting stories into the world. So
Yeah, I and tell us about your Substack work as
yeah.
well. So again, let us know the title of the full title of your memoir, where to find it, and then also your Substack, because that's really what drew me to your work initially, and then I went and got the book.
Yeah. So my book is called Into the Soul of the World: My Journey to Healing, and it's available. It was published by Hachette in 2023, and it's available at all the big bookstores and through Amazon, and you can order it through your favorite indie bookstore. It's available everywhere, and so that's my book, and it is the story of how I became an adventure writer, how my life fell apart, and how I kind of pieced it back together through all these different ways, as you know. And then so my Substack is called Seeking Letters to the Restless. It's a newsletter that is free right now anyway, and you can sign up for it. Look up Seeking Letters to the Restless, and I try to write kind of adventurous stories about seeking oneself, seeking some kind of understanding of what a spiritual life might be when you're full of doubt. It's for everybody who kind of longs to have some connection with something greater than themselves, but also lives in the world of science. So it's kind of like has a foot in both worlds. I'm constantly trying to understand what that means. So
To listeners, I highly recommend it, as well as to pick up a copy of the book. I read the book, and then I was going back and checking out some of the Substack. And there was one where I think you'd you'd gone down to the river, and you I can't remember, you went swimming or something, and I was like, oh no, not a river, not a river. Brad, stay away from the river.
yeah.
But I think it's an interesting recurring kind of theme in your
It
life. And
is. I'm drawn to rivers. When I lived more in downtown Boulder, I would walk the river every day, and it never crossed my mind that the weird connection it was with it. So I've been to rivers all over the world and been obsessed with them. And so Freud wasn't, I don't know if everything was right, but he wasn't a dummy either. So
well, I know you lived in Santa Fe for a long time, right? In
yeah,
the Pecos River.
yes,
So that I grew up, this is a crazy aside, but I grew up hearing stories about my maternal grandparents who had moved from upstate New York to the Santa Fe area. So my grandfather, who had tuberculosis, could be in the dry air. Like that's
yeah,
before antibiotics, that's what they told you to do.
right,
And they had no money, and so they rented a little shack on the banks of the Pecos River. And the only way to get to that shack was to walk across a swinging bridge across the Pecos River. And
wow,
I've spent the last, I don't know how many decades, trying to find where that is. I'm sure all the structures are gone now or whatever, but to try to find where that is, and I have not been able to get back there. And
Well, we'll
I'm
have to go
obsessed with
down
it.
there sometime. When
Yeah,
you're down there, come
it'd be
out and
great.
let's go find it. I'd love to do that. I hope that's in your memoir. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I have these stories of these in my mind, like of my grandparents raising rabbits, because that was what I had been told. Like
yeah,
he was ill, and she took care of him, and they raised rabbits to sell, and it was just on the banks of the Pecos River. And now my mom and two of my brothers and their families live in Santa Fe. So who would it's interesting, these loops, right, that we come
yeah,
back to.
definitely.
I read this thing the other day, and it's somewhat tongue in cheek, but it said, why do why do my Why are my parents always so good at pushing my buttons? I know why. Because they implanted them there. And it's just like these. This is not a knock on my parents, but
Yeah, no, I
it's
get
like
it.
those themes, right, that come back.
Yeah.
It's
You
the
know,
boomerang stuff.
a good memoir does have that kind of looping, the past and the present are kind of constantly revisited, and things that happened at one point in a life end up coming up as memories later. And yeah, there's a lot of that in a memoir. So, and in life too, as you know. So I bet you we can find this place on the Pecos.
We probably could. Yeah. Now I'm going to get obsessed like
Yeah.
you. What did you? And I don't want to dive too deep into this because I know it's a personal journey. But were there ever times when you were writing your memoir where you were like, "Dude, what are you doing? Like this is just rehashing things, and I'm already a successful writer." By the way, that's the style of writing is kind of a hybrid. I love the fact that you're such an effective writer apart from the memoir theme, right? Because a lot of memoirs, it's just hard to get into the actual to live into the non-fictional dream part because it's
Yeah.
just the writing's not effective. So I love that part. But like, were there times when you said I should could just be writing about something much more factual, real world, and be done with it?
At some point I became under the spell of memoirs, and I think it was around 2013. I started reading a lot of them. I began teaching them, and began to understand what makes one, better than another. And I just it became kind of this obsession, like we talked about obsessions. And so, at that point I knew I was going to write one. Whether I ever had, you know, I think writing about life became, and I realized I kind of had a superpower about it. And so, yeah, there's lots of amazing things to write about. And I think you can always write about those other amazing things through a personal lens. And that to me became a lot more interesting than just going out and writing like you could write a profile of somebody, and that's fun. But if you write a personal essay about your meeting with them, then you have a lot more room to go down different rows and what's this person mean to me, as well as exploring them. So it became a bit of an obsession to write in a personal way about the world. So I think there's a both and to it, I guess is what I'm saying.
It's interesting as you're speaking. I'm also a fan of I can never pronounce his last name. Sebastian Junger.
Younger, yeah.
Yeah, the Perfect Storm guy.
Right.
And of course, The Perfect Storm is a nonfiction, just this amazing narrative of courage and also a real foolhardy story of thinking, you can do better than nature. And
Yeah.
uh, but then his latest couple books are, I mean, his reporting kind of went from that to then some wartime reporting
Yeah.
and some PTSD related experiences. And then now his last two books are, he had one about a walk that he took as he was going through a divorce.
Yeah.
And the latest one I think is In My Year of Dying. I don't know if you've read that, but
I have not read that
yeah,
yet, but it's on my shelf. Yeah.
it's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And here's this, and I'm not going to spoiler alert. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but like to this guy who was writing about ships and storms and all that and king crab fishing or no, actually it wasn't. It was tuna or whatever. That to now writing about what it's like to nearly die and be
Yeah.
staring into the abyss.
Well, I know, I think as we age, we get more reflective, but also I know he's had some PTSD, and that the past and the present merge together with PTSD, and it becomes a very fascinating thing to write about. So I think it's natural for those of us on the other side of 45 or 50 to be going down this road, but especially him who's done war reporting and has some serious, has seen some things. So.
Do you have another memoir in you?
I do, and I've been talking with my agent about it, and it's probably pretty reflective of what I've been writing about lately. It's this seeking, which is a theme in my other memoir, but for the longest time, I've wanted to have faith in God, and it's been an obsession. And I've also, as a person who appreciates science and was a very scientific journalist and was very just the facts, ma'am, kind of a guy. I have these two sides, and they're always at war. And so the book will be exploring this kind of discussion, the inner discussion I've had about faith. So, and very different though from my memoir. It won't be organized as a chronologically as a story. It'll be kind of thematically oriented. So there'll be a few stories from the past in it, but some new ones too.
I can't wait to read that. It sounds like a great follow up to your first memoir. What does your family think about? I'm asking for a friend. I'm actually asking because as I begin to put pen to paper on some of my experiences, that's always the little voice here that's like, hey,
Yeah.
wait, can I say that? And if I do, I know I should, and in what way? And so what does your family say and your friends? And you've got,
Yeah.
ex-partners and the whole
Right.
piece.
I think that one of the things that got me ready to write my book, I did a fair amount of therapy, one of the things I finally was able to understand is all of us have different stories. Even siblings in a family. There's kids have different relationships with their parents than other kids, and plus birth order, and so no story. And I used to think that my story had to match up. We talked about that with my dad, this obsession that needed to match up, and finally I let go of that. I'm someone who takes reality very seriously, and I know I've learned over time I can really trust my own reality, even when it's at odds with somebody else's. And that became the linchpin I had to kind of arrive at to get comfortable writing memoir. My dad and I are friendly now, and we have kind of a growing, wonderful relationship. He's 87 now, and not in great health. My brother and I haven't spoken in years, and so that's a painful thing. And as far as friends, I think some of them roll their eyes at me. I mean, the intensity with which I write about my life, it's not everybody's cup of tea, and it sort of is, and I don't care. I have found, going back to one of the gifts of memoir is, and I was writing about this today on Substack in a note to someone who commented on my piece, is when you start living finally your authentic life, it's weird how like things start to click. People come into your life who you haven't been there because you've been hiding yourself and they didn't know you were you. And so your life begins to change when you put stuff out there for the better, and people finally see who you really are, and you'll pull in people who you're meant to be with, and you'll repel the people that can't handle it or don't think it's not for them. So
Wow, that's the idea of truth, right? Whose truth
yeah,
is the truth.
right. And so honesty is the word that I kind of lean more heavily into. I do love the word truth, but I also know in memoir writing, we just try to be as honest as we can, and knowing that the truth is elusive and no one has a lock on it. And yeah,
It's so interesting as you say that. I think about things that happened to me as a kid, or I'll be hanging out with my siblings or on a phone call, and we're joking around. We're like, hey, you remember that time that this happened? And we were both there.
yeah,
Perspective, and granted, it's like 35, 40 years ago, but the perspective is totally different.
yeah,
Totally different.
yeah.
Now, I don't know which is, I know what I know what I can feel in my body, and that's all I can really speak to. But then I think, man, like how much of it has shifted to in my retelling and my recasting of it internally over all these years. And I don't even think it really matters that much, right? Like it's what it is right now for me.
Memory is a very complicated thing, and it is faulty. And the more, you learn about memory, they think now that every time you have a memory, you think of some memory, the more recent version of that is what gets filed away. So, you know, throw in writing about something now, when I think back at some of the stuff I've written about, the image I have is the image that I wrote about, and I'm not sure I can even access the original memories of years ago, because it's become a contemporary memory. It's complicated.
How was the experience of having an editor work on this on a memoir as opposed to you writing about, whatever, whitewater rapids in the
Yeah.
Grand Canyon or something?
You know, First of all, I love editors. I was one, and
Right.
I've always worked with. I was surrounded by great ones at Outside. My work always got better when I worked with editors. So I've been always very accepting of collaborating, knowing that writing gets better when you have a smart person pushing you and helping you try to get clear about what you're trying to say. As far as the memoir itself, you know, I I think because getting my truth out or getting my honest version out was so important to me. I had lived, uh, I'd had a lot of my experience denied in my family, and it was like just simmering underneath me, not in anger so much in like I just had to get my version of it out, and
It's festering,
yeah,
festering. It's
festering, and so I was so open in writing my book. I go deeper and more, uh, probably more revealing than a lot of people do in memoirs, and way more than even I don't ask. I try to help my students get vulnerable and my clients. I also know they've got to set their guardrails for what they're willing to share. There's some great memoirs out there that don't go to the bone quite like mine does. It's just part of my nature that I do that. I don't know, understand why. So that's one of the discussions we have early on is figuring out, how vulnerable you want to get. And I do try to help people get a little bit more vulnerable because that is where we connect with our readers. When we're vulnerable, we open ourselves up to being seen by our readers, and the more you hide, the more the reader knows you're hiding. So, and so this is a whole other topic about how it's a relationship with the author and the reader. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. I was open to it. I loved it actually.
it's how can so you've talked about the book where obviously people can find it online, bookstores, your Substack. You've got this I'm not going to call it a side business because it's the central business, right? It's what you do as well, right?
Yeah.
Is you write and you do this, guiding and coaching and mentoring. How do people find you, and what does it look like if someone's listening to this and they're like, hey, people always tell me I have cool stories to tell, or people are always shocked when I tell them something, and oh man, dude, you should write a book, and then you're like, oh my God, where do I start? How do people find you, and what does that guiding look like?
Yeah. So you find me at bradwetzler.com, and that's BradWetzler.com. And you can read about my services there, and you can also sign up there for a free 30-minute consult, and that's really step one. So sign up and let's talk for 30 minutes. I'll actually coach you, give you some ideas for if you whether you, first of all, we'll talk about working together, but I also, even if you don't want to work with me, I'll coach you for 30 minutes. So that's step one, and then I have different plans, and they can, we can talk about that. I have 6 month write your memoir plans, at various prices, and basically we meet either 2 times, 3 times, or 4 times a month, and I walk you through the process of writing your book and getting your draft done. So,
Yeah, again, I encourage listeners to check that out. If I'm sure, most of us have at some point had someone go, wow, that really, you've lived quite a life, and
yeah, no,
you
for
should
sure.
you should write some of this down. Um, and it's an interesting. Again, I return to this theme of I think because the internet sphere lends itself to people being quote unquote experts in a lot of stuff, coaches in a lot of stuff, right? And then you're like, you dive in and into it and you go, were they ever successful at the original thing, or are they just successful at coaching people to do something that they've never even done, right? And you've done the hard work. You've been the professional writer. You've lived that, and you understand the process, understand working with an editor, and then you've also gone through the incredibly, the process of opening yourself up to writing your memoir. You could have dodged that whole thing your whole life.
It wasn't meant to be, to dodge it. It was, I think I was a truth teller in my family, and it was. I've lived it as an adult too now, so it's something it's just part of my DNA. I've got to say what's true about my life and the world. So,
but you've been so generous with your time, Brad, and I truly appreciate this opportunity to sit down and chat with you, and encourage everybody to check out all the information we talked about today, and I'll put it in the show notes. I wanted to finish with just a question that I ask all the guests. If you had the opportunity to design a billboard, and you can't have the cop out of like, I don't believe in billboards because they're visual pollution. A couple people have said that. I'm like, okay, this is a thought exercise. Okay. You can make it biodegradable. I know you live in Boulder. You had the opportunity to design a billboard for the side of a thoroughfare or freeway. What does that billboard say about what you believe in, who you are, what you find to be important?
Yeah. I think probably in keeping with my Substack, it would be something along the lines of keep seeking, keep saying what's true, keep looking for what's true about you and your place in the world, and that there's and trusting your experience, all those things. That's not a very tidy billboard, but coming home to trust who you are and trust your experience and keep opening up. That's the message, I think, that leads to healing.
Well, I thank you for that. I think that's an apropos place to pause the conversation. And I can feel in our conversation that you've, at some level, come home to a place of peace, and reflection and reflectiveness. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to coach other people in that authentically either.
This is a good time in my life. It's just sort of I have arrived here at a place of calm and maybe not ease. I'm always pushing myself to do new things, but this is a good season for me, and I'm cherishing it. So,
well, thank you so much, Brad, and it's been an honor to speak with you.
Thank you, David. It's been an honor likewise.
Thanks for joining us on the Hangout Podcast. You can send us an email at podcastinfo@proton.me. Many thanks to my daughter Maya for editing this episode. I'd also like to underline that this podcast is entirely separate from my day job, and as such, all opinions expressed herein are mine and mine alone. Thanks for coming on in and hanging out.